my reminder and messed up the Eastern time zone with the Central time zone. So I actually was just napping, and I woke up and went, oh, and I freaked out. So I am so sorry. Okay, so yeah. So with that said, at 15:15, so I'll go, as you said, 30-40 minutes, and then leave some time and just let you direct from there, Priscilla. But thank you everyone for joining. It really is just an absolutely historic day in so many ways. But so Priscilla asked me to just talk about something that really I've been talking about for years, and I do apologize if any of you have ever sort of heard me work through any of this material before, but really just focusing on the centrality of Israel, and also understanding sort of the role of Islam within the end time biblical narrative. And as I said, if you've heard me teach through this, it's almost real introductory. It's such basic introductory material, but by the same token, if you've never sort of heard any of these things, it's very helpful. But whenever talking about the end times, and obviously there's just such a tremendous wide range of views in the body of Christ concerning the return of Jesus and the end times and this sort of thing. But I always just start with a very, very basic principle, which is the Israel centricity of the Bible. And so I always just say, whenever we're trying to understand any particular passage in the Bible, obviously context is always key. And if we're just looking at the broad context of the entire Bible, the Bible is a thoroughly Jerusalem and Israel centric book. And in a broader sense, you could say it's a very Middle Eastern centric book. And that may seem very basic, but by the same token, for a lot of Americans or for a lot of Westerners, it can almost be revolutionary, a revolutionary idea, particularly because Americans, and I understand if not everyone on the call is necessarily American, but we're just so infamous for having such an American-centric view of everything. And so we kind of think, well, the United States is the most powerful economy in the world, or potentially the most powerful economy and military in the world. Therefore, since we're sort of the center of the world, the Bible or God's world should revolve around us as well. And the fact of the matter is, the Bible simply is not, it just does not revolve around the United States at all. Quite to the contrary. It's not to say that we're not relevant within God's heart, but we're just not at the center of this story. So once we begin by just acknowledging, just recognizing that every story in the Bible revolves around Jerusalem, around Israel, around the Middle East, then when we start talking about the end times, we go, okay, well, the basic narrative of the entire Bible, the entire story of redemption culminates with the return of the King, the return of Jesus, the prophesied Son of David, who's coming back specifically to Jerusalem to reestablish the throne of his father David, according to the words of the prophets. Then this very sort of Israel-centric narrative makes sense. And so I always just start there, just in a very, as I said, very sort of broad sense. You can look at passages like, for example, Joel chapter 3, where the context is clearly the gathering of the nations, the gathering of the Gentiles against Israel as led by the Antichrist. The context is the judgment of the nations at the return of Jesus. And so in Joel chapter 3, verse 11 through 12, it says, "Hasten and come, all of you surrounding nations, and gather yourselves there. Bring down your warriors, O Lord. The nations stir themselves up and come to the valley of Jehoshaphat," which of course is a reference to Jerusalem, to the valley in between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. It says, "For there I will sit to judge all of the surrounding nations." So you have just this very general statement. The term in the Hebrew is goyim saviv, the nations round about, the nations that surround Israel. So when it describes the nations that will be judged, the nations that follow the Antichrist, the nations that invade Israel, it specifically uses terms like the surrounding nations. And of course, it means the nations literally that surround Israel. I always joke, and say, yeah, but some people will say, well, when it says surrounding nations, because the earth is a globe, it means every single nation in the earth. And I go, yeah, technically every single nation, because it's a globe, surrounds every single nation. This statement doesn't simply mean nothing. It does actually mean Israel's neighbors. Likewise, in Zechariah 12, verse 2, it says, behold, I'm about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all of the surrounding peoples, the Am Saviv, the peoples that surround Israel. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah, the southern portion of Israel. So you start out with very general statements like that, and then you can look at, quite literally, dozens of passages throughout the prophets, throughout the Bible, that actually name names. And so this is important. The prophets, they don't speak only vaguely and generally, but they actually name names. They point to peoples, tribes, nations, and regions that will follow the Antichrist, invade the land of Israel. And so it's important that we actually take a look at those names, and we begin with passages that do just use very straightforward literal language. We don't start right out with all the apocalyptic texts that speak of beasts and horns and statues and all of this highly symbolic language. We start out with that which is easy to understand, that which is literal, that which is straightforward, and the type of passages that are, as I said, are repeated multiple times throughout the scriptures. So, for example, in Ezekiel chapter 30, verse 1 through 5, it says, thus saith the Lord, a wail, alas for the day of the Lord is near. Okay, so obviously the context is the day of the Lord. It's the end times. It will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. And then it starts naming the nations that will be judged, again, in the context of the day of the Lord. It says a sword will come upon Egypt. Anguish will be in Cush. Cush is immediately south of Egypt, modern day northern Sudan. When the slain shall fall in Egypt, Cush and Put and Lud. Lud is Lydia. That's essentially modern day Turkey, or you could say Western Turkey. All of Arabia and Libya, all of the people of the land that are in league, they shall fall by the sword. So to be clear, this is not, a comprehensive list, but when you do have lists, when the prophets name names of the nations that will come against Israel, they are consistently in every single last verse throughout the Bible. They're always Middle Eastern or North African nations. Every single one is a Muslim majority nation. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that there's not also going to be blessings for any of these nations. We don't view the future of any one of these nations exclusively based on a passage like this, because then there'll be other passages, for example, in Isaiah 19, that also talks about a revival in Egypt. And so whenever we're considering any particular nation, we need to consider the wealth or the sort of broad perspective that the Bible gives in any of these nations. But again, when we look at the verses that speak of judgment of Israel's enemies, they're consistently the nations that surround Israel. Micah 5 is a passage that I always like to look at because it's such a well-known Messianic prophecy concerning the Bethlehem-Born Messiah. It says, but you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you're small among the clans of Judah, so even though you're just a clan of Judah, you're not even a tribe, in talking about the area of Bethlehem and Ephrathah, out of you will come one for me who will be ruler over all of Israel. Okay, so it's clearly talking about the Bethlehem-born Messiah, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. Now, what does this Messiah do? According to Micah, it says, he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the Lord his God. Okay, he will deliver us from the Assyrian when he invades our land and marches into our borders. Some translations will say he will deliver us from the Assyrians when the Assyrians invade our land and marches into our borders. Others, the Assyrian. When you look at the interpretation of this text among some of the early church writers, this was viewed as referring to the Antichrist. And again, the Antichrist here is referred to as the Assyrian. And so I always ask our friends in the body of Christ who are preterists, who try to say this entire passage is already fulfilled in history. I would say, when did Jesus deliver Israel from a military invasion led by the Assyrian? Because it's clearly the context. This is not sort of a historical reference. It's actually talking about the Messiah. And of course, he didn't do that during his earthly ministry, but it's something that he will do when he returns. He will literally deliver Israel from an invasion from the surrounding nations, as Ezekiel 30 refers to, as we just saw, as Joel chapter 3 refers to, as Zechariah refers to, as all the prophets refer to. Jesus actually returns as the divine warrior to deliver his people 2 minutes to midnight. He actually comes back to save them from the invasion of the nations. There's a whole host of texts. I've written quite a lot about this in my most recent book, Sinai to Zion, that actually describe Jesus when he returns in a royal military procession from the south of Israel. So he's essentially marching up to Israel in as I said, a royal military procession from the south, like the greater Moses. In many ways, it's like he's the greater Moses who's marching. And so in Isaiah 63, verses 1 through 4, Isaiah is essentially in Jerusalem looking south. He's looking down to the south toward the areas of Sinai, of Edom, modern day Jordan, Saudi Arabia. And he says, "Who is this coming from Edom, from Basra, with his garments stained crimson? Who is this robed in splendor, striding forward in the greatness of his strength?" And the Lord responds, he says, "It is I, speaking in righteousness, mighty to save. Why are your garments red like someone who's been treading the winepress? Why do you look like, if you're Jesus, why do you not look like this sort of pacifist Caucasian hippie that we see in all of the Christian artwork, that's popularly portrayed? Why do you look like someone who's been stomping grapes all day?" And he responds, he says, "I have trodden the winepress alone. From the nations, from the Gentiles, no one was with me. I trampled them in my anger. I trod them down in my wrath, and their blood spattered all of my garments. I stained all my clothing, for the day of vengeance was in my heart. The year of my redemption has come." So again, the clear context is the return of Jesus, the redemption of the Lord after he returns. And he's literally portrayed as being a warrior drenched in blood, marching from the south up toward Israel. Again, it's through the region specifically of modern day Jordan. And again, I want to be clear. I do believe the Lord has a tremendous revival for the nation of Jordan. And there are passages that actually speak of this, but there's also passages that speak of the Lord marching through that region, judging the nations that are out to kill his people. And there's numerous passages that actually describe the inhabitants of Israel and Judah fleeing in the context of the last days and sort of fleeing into the desert of the Exodus in modern day Jordan and throughout that region. So as Jesus marches through this area, he's actually delivering his people from prison camps, from being prisoners of war. He's executing vengeance against the armies of the Antichrist. And that's where this type of image comes from. Isaiah 34, in many ways, it's a sister prophecy that goes along with Isaiah 63. It says, "My sword has drunk its fill in the heavens. Behold, it descends for judgment upon Edom, the people I have devoted to destruction. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Basra." Basra, Edom, these are essentially synonyms, that same part of the world. "A great slaughter in the land of Edom. Their land shall drink its fill of blood. Their soil shall be gorged with fat. For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause or the controversy of Zion." So again, it's the same general story that's told over and over and over again. We could look at numerous texts that talk about this. In my book, Mideast Beast, I sort of work through several of the key texts that sort of fall into this category. But as I said, these are passages that are all literal. They use literal language when it says, Egypt, it means Egypt. It doesn't symbolically mean France. Now, to be clear, I want to say, I'm not saying that Europe will not be involved in any of this. I'm not saying other parts of the world will not be involved. But what I am saying is where the scriptures are clear, where the scriptures are consistent, where they point to the same thing and emphasize a particular part of the world. As we're trying to understand what the Bible says about this, we also should emphasize these things. And where the scriptures are silent, we should be very, very careful. Again, because the popular view in so much of the church is this very European-centric sort of understanding of the end times. It's all about Europe. And of course, that makes sense because prophecy books are most often written by Westerners. And so we sort of think, as I said, the United States is the center of the world. And we trace much of our history through Europe, law, culture, and, yada, yada. And so we've created an eschatology which it essentially accommodates our own particular worldview. And yes, we've done that by misinterpreting a few key texts in the Bible that are very symbolic, that are very difficult to interpret. And the foundation for these texts is Daniel 2, which is the prophecy, Daniel's prophecy of the metallic statue. It's actually Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Nebuchadnezzar being the king of Babylon. And so he has this dream of this, it's a metallic statue, a massive metallic statue that's broken up between 5 different segments or components. And so Daniel actually gives Nebuchadnezzar an interpretation of this statue and what it means. And he explains that the head of gold represents Babylon. And then after that, the next kingdom that would succeed Babylon is in the statue, it's the chest and the arms of silver, and that represents the Medo-Persian Empire. Then the belly down to the thighs are bronze, and that's the Alexandrian Greek Empire. Then you have the legs of iron, and this is simply referred to as the fourth kingdom. Now, the book of Daniel actually names Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. It calls them by name, but it never actually names the fourth kingdom. It never names the legs of iron. And of course, the legs of iron also, they're sort of broken up between the legs of iron, and then you have the feet, which are a mixture of iron and clay. So the question is, what is this fourth kingdom? If we're considering, okay, could this be the Roman Empire? I mean, it literally says in virtually every Bible that we have in the subheadings, it'll say the Roman Empire. Is it the Roman Empire, or are there any other candidates? And of course, I would suggest that the historical Islamic Caliphate, the historical Islamic Empire, is another significant candidate. In fact, I do believe that's what it's talking about. And so when you simply look at what the scriptures say, when you look at the actual criteria that the scriptures give us, and you say, okay, here's what the scriptures say. Does the Roman Empire fulfill the biblical criteria, or does the Islamic Empire fulfill the criteria? In chapter 2, verse 40, in speaking of the fourth kingdom, it says this: the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all of the others. So this is talking about the rise of this fourth kingdom. It says when it rises, it will crush and break Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, because it says all the others. There's really only 3 others. And so you ask the question, you say, okay, did the Roman Empire crush and break Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece? And if we simply look at maps of this part of the world, or look at these empires, and you say, did the Roman Empire crush, conquer? I mean, if we're just talking simple geography, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, the answer is sort of, but really not. It's basically, it conquered and defeated about a quarter of the land holdings of these kingdoms. Like, for example, if you look at the Medo-Persian Empire, I mean, that thing extended all the way to India, all the way up into Europe. When you look at the Roman Empire, at the time of its greatest extent, which, by the way, was really just a few months, under Emperor Trajan in AD 116, Trajan wanted to be the next Alexander the Great, and he did make his way down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. He reached the ruins of the city of Babylon, and but as history would have it, he had a stroke, or at least historians believe that he had a stroke, and he died shortly thereafter. And so then his successor was Hadrian, his former general, who became the new emperor, and he determined that from that point forward, he pulled the eastern boundaries of the Roman Empire back to essentially sort of hug the Mediterranean. But even if you include, this very brief little couple-month window under Emperor Trajan, it still, at the very most, was about a third of the land holdings of the Medo-Persian and Alexandrian Greek empires. And again, it reached, a good part of the Babylonian kingdom, but it really only conquered maybe half of it. And so you go, if we're just simply talking geography, it's difficult to make the Roman Empire fit. On the other hand, if you say, well, what about the historical Islamic empire? In the 7th century after Muhammad dies, his successors just exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula and with, unprecedented historical lightning speed, just conquered the Middle East and quickly swept across North Africa all the way up to the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and conquered that side of the world all the way on the other side, extending all the way to India. It absolutely crushed and conquered and defeated and broke in pieces Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. In fact, to this very day, it still completely controls the vast majority of ancient Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. Yes, there's some parts, obviously, of Eastern Europe that were part of Greece that Islam is not dominant over. But for the most part, Islam meets the very basic biblical criteria, whereas the Roman Empire really doesn't. And that's one verse, of course, that speaks of the rise of this kingdom, but it's really pretty straightforward, pretty clear. Back several verses, verse 33 through 35, it speaks of the destruction of the fourth kingdom. Daniel is speaking to Nebuchadnezzar. He says, "You continued looking until a stone was cut out without human hands." Now, this is referring to the return of the Messiah, the establishment of the kingdom of God at the end of the age in our future. And it says, "It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay, and it crushed them." So specifically, when Jesus returns, the portion of the statue, again, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, it will strike the statue on its feet of iron and clay. Now, the feet of iron and clay are most often understood to be a latter-day revival of whatever the fourth kingdom is. So if the fourth kingdom is the Roman Empire, then we're looking for a last days revival of the fourth kingdom. If it's Islam, then we're looking for a last days revival of the historical Islamic caliphate. And so that is the kingdom, the empire that Jesus will destroy and crush when he returns. And when that happens, it says, then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all crushed at the same time. And they become like chaff from the summer threshing floor as the wind blows them away and nothing is left. So by virtue of the destruction of this final empire, all of the others will be destroyed at the same time. And so in the same way that verse 40 spoke of the destruction or the demise of this fourth kingdom, it spoke of the rise of the fourth kingdom. Here it speaks of the demise, the destruction. And so when Jesus returns, and you say, if the Roman Empire were fully revived right now, Jesus returned and destroyed it, would Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece be destroyed? And the answer is, again, partially. Whereas if the Islamic Empire is fully revived and Jesus returns and destroys it, will Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece be destroyed? And the answer is absolutely, completely. And so this is, again, it's really just an issue of sort of looking at geography, looking at maps. I work with the underground church from Iran, and I remember meeting with them and saying, did the Roman Empire crush and destroy the Persian Empire? And they just laughed. They're like, what? Did the Roman Empire defeat Persia? No, no one ever defeated us. And the Roman Empire could never defeat us. And they go, but Islam did. So to different believers from different part of the world, when they look at these statements, they go, oh, this is very clear what it's talking about. Again, for Westerners or to those that have just been raised sort of with a Western mindset, and when you actually look at some of the passages, you go, my goodness, what I've always been taught about the end times doesn't really fit. The Roman Empire doesn't really fit the biblical criteria. then when you sort of elaborate a bit more on some of the details concerning crushing, beyond mere geographic borders, you start talking culture, you start talking religion, languages. These are things that really make up a nation. It's borders, language borders, culture, and religion is obviously part of that. Again, Islam meets the criteria quite magnificently. Wherever Islam has gone, it really, in so many ways, has been an Arab supremacist program. Why, for example, will African Christian feel obligated to name their children an Arabic name if they live, for example, in Morocco or in North Africa somewhere? Well, it's because wherever Islam has gone, it's really imposed in sort of Arab supremacist, a 7th century Arab supremacist culture and religion. And so Islam really does meet that sort of broader description of being a crushing force. Rome, on the other hand, it's important to qualify in terms of various ancient empires. Rome was actually quite a relatively tolerant empire. Yes, they had a brutal military. They were strong. They would crush uprisings and this type of thing, but they actually sort of celebrated the level of tolerance that they displayed again for an ancient empire. So, for example, in the time of the 1st century, the time of the New Testament, Israel was allowed, and in fact, there was this very special exemption for a lot of ancient religions to continue to practice their ancient religion. That's why they had the temple. That's why the Jews continue to practice Judaism under the watchful eye of the Roman Empire, of course. But they celebrated. They said, oh, look how, sort of magnanimous we are. Rome was actually known for establishing structure, infrastructure, aqueducts and roads, the Pax Romana, Roman laws and the peace that came with it, and this type of thing. Whereas Islam, its sort of approach, when you really do study Islamic history, even from Islam's own history, it didn't take that approach. Later it did a bit, where they would conquer a region and they would extract very exorbitant taxes, again, similar to the Romans. But early on, in the first 10 years of Islamic conquest, the stories, city after city that were literally razed to the ground. They would come in and just wipe out an entire city, decimate the people, kill men, take some of the children and women, and essentially march them back to oftentimes, sometimes 30 to 60,000 women and children, march them back to Mecca as slaves and concubines and this type of thing. So, again, Islam matches the biblical descriptions of this crushing empire, whereas in so many ways the Roman Empire, it's very difficult to make it fit. Now, Daniel chapter 7, it's really, again, a sister chapter that goes with Daniel 2, but instead of using the symbolism of this metallic statue, it uses the symbolism of beasts, of these 4 gruesome beasts. And there you have a 4th beast, which correlates to the 4th empire, the legs of iron. And there in chapter 7, verse 7, it says, after that, in my night vision, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast. So it's describing this final empire. It says it was terrifying and frightening, very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims, and then it trampled underfoot whatever was left. So you think about that, sort of there's this initial wave of destruction within the first 10 years after Islamic conquest. Literally half of global Christendom was wiped out within 10 years. All of the great missionary sending capitals of the ancient church, of Antioch, right there on the border of Turkey and modern day Turkey and Syria, was decimated. The 7 churches of Revelation, Jerusalem, Alexandria, they were quickly subjugated under Islam. And then in more recent years, you look at sort of these struggling Christian communities in the nations of Iraq and Syria. And after ISIS sweeps through, the news stories of, well, there were a few 100,000 Christians, but after ISIS, it's down to, a fraction of that. And it really, it sort of fulfills this description of whatever's left, even it tramples underfoot. It's this gradual destruction carried out by Islam. So that's kind of a real simple overview, of the centrality, I'll say, of Islam within this very Israel-centric narrative. Now, obviously, that opens up a lot of questions. Everyone says, well, what about the United States? What about Europe? And this type of thing. And again, I want to be very clear. In no way, shape, or form am I saying that we're not relevant, that Europe won't play a central role or, a premier role in the end times, or Russia or China or any of these important global players. But what I'm saying is, when we simply look at the biblical narrative, we understand that the primary emphasis are the nations that surround Israel. And then with that in mind, I want to reemphasize, there's also a lot of passages that speak of revival in a lot of these nations. So I don't want to paint an overly gloomy picture. But this is sort of just a good starting point to sort of grasp and understand as I said, the very Israel centricity of the narrative. And it helps us as we're sort of looking out at the world. It helps us with regard to prayer. It helps us how to align our thought process with the Lord's thought process as we're interceding and all of these things. So I will actually end right there, and very rarely and ahead of time, and let you take it from there. Priscilla, I don't know if you wanted to do any Q&A or how you wanted to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was a great overview. And I'm sure it's new for some of us, but a great reminder for some of us as well. If you guys have any questions, I think how we'll do this is you can either put it in the chat, or you can just unmute and take a moment to ask your questions if you have a question. And Daniel's raising his hand. If you know how to raise your hand on Zoom, as not all of us do, you're also welcome to do that. Just click on your name more, but you can also just unmute. So Daniel, why don't we go ahead and start with you and what question you have?
Yeah, thank you, Joel, so much for taking the time to come and share. I wanted to ask kind of what your interpretation was of the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9, especially the latter half, where I'm super intrigued by it because it seems like it kind of fuses together the first coming of the Messiah with the Antichrist reign. And it doesn't, obviously we don't know the day or the hour, only the Father, but just what are your thoughts, or what's your take on the unique way in which kind of Jesus's first coming and the destruction of Jerusalem? I'm taking it by the Roman Empire in 70 AD, and also just the Antichrist reign and the abomination, the desolation.
Sure. So obviously Daniel 9, the prophecy of 70 weeks, is one of the most complicated and controversial and yet foundational prophecies in the entire Bible. Now, I would just say that Daniel 8, Daniel 9, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 9, and then Daniel chapters 10 through 12. These are Daniel's 4 visions. They're all telling the same story. And so Daniel 9 and the prophecy of 70 weeks is really telling the same general story. It's reiterating the same point over and over again. And it starts out, obviously, Daniel is studying the words of Jeremiah. He realizes that the 70-year exile, Babylonian exile, the time is up. And then he begins to repent on behalf of his people. And then the Lord visits him, and he realizes, oh, actually, there's another period of 77s now, or 70 weeks. Now, a week being not 7 days, but 7 years. So you have a total of 490 years, and it kind of breaks it up into a few different sections. But I take the interpretation that the final week, so that's the final 7-year period, I take the traditional futurist view, which is that's referring to a final 7-year period at the end of the age before the return of Jesus. And if we actually sort of work through that, it tells us that the previous 300 and, 490, the previous 69 weeks end with the cutting off of the Messiah. So when the Messiah is cut off, that ends the 69 weeks, and we have 1 week left. Now, then it says this, it says, the people of the prince to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And so what happens is everyone assumes that that's talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The problem with that, in my opinion, is that that's 40 years outside of the window of the prophecy. The entire prophecy is about a specific period of 70 sevens or 70 weeks. Messiah was cut off, let's just say 30 AD, 33 AD, in that sort of window. The destruction of Jerusalem was roughly 40 years later. And so there's, in my opinion, a false assumption among commentators that that's obviously talking about 70 AD, whereas I think the natural reading of the prophecy, and if we actually just take the prophecy for what it says, that when the Messiah is cut off, you sort of pause, and then the final 7 years culminates just before the return of Jesus. It's simply saying that once again in the last days, the city and the sanctuary will be destroyed. By who? By the Antichrist, by the people of the prince to come. That's referring to the Antichrist. And the reason that it's important to take that view is because you actually have references in Daniel, what's referred to the abomination causes desolation. It's the seminal timing marker at the center, in the middle of this final 7-year period. And it repeats and emphasizes this time period multiple times in Daniel's 4 visions. And it's always right in the middle of the 7 years, it's halfway through this week. And so it refers to the ceasing of offerings and the abomination that causes desolation. It refers to this in Daniel 8, sort of in the middle, like roughly verses 11 through 15, sort of right there. It refers to it here at the end of Daniel 9, verse 26 and 27. It refers to it again in Daniel 11, verse 31. And then again in Daniel 12, verse 11. So 4 times you have a reference to the ceasing of office and abomination that causes desolation. And it's always mentioned in a negative sense. It's a very negative thing. It's a very bad thing. It's something that's carried out by the Antichrist. But what happens strangely is that a lot of commentators, for some reason, just here in chapter 9, they try to frame the ceasing of offerings as a good thing that's actually affected by Jesus. And so, if you just do sort of a simple chart, you go, well, in Daniel 8, the ceasing of offerings is negative. It's carried out by the Antichrist, or some people would say Antiochus Epiphanes, historical Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a foreshadow of the Antichrist. Again, there in chapter 11, verse 31, they would say that was carried out by Antiochus, yea, the Antichrist. Likewise, in chapter 12, it's the Antichrist. But then in chapter 9, to say that it's somehow a positive thing carried out by the Messiah is, in my opinion, a very inconsistent approach to interpretation. Yeah, I would take, and by the way, let me just add to this, Daniel, is when you look at the earliest church writings, the interpretations of this, both Hippolytus and Irenaeus, they both take this view that it's talking about a 7-year period before the return of Jesus, that where the Antichrist will be active. And so you'll hear a lot of people say, well, that's just a dispensationalist view that's new and over the past 150 years. No, it's actually the earliest interpretation held by Christians. So it's far from a new view. Dispensationalists do sort of have their own unique spin that they put on it, but it's far from being a unique, new, or novel view.
Thank you. That's great. We have another question here.
Okay. Hello.
Howdy.
So, and this is something that I run into a lot when I have discussions with people about these things. How do you tend to view the application of current or past geopolitical developments to interpretation of biblical prophecies or the understanding of them?
Well, it depends what the particular geopolitical development is. So I would say, one, there's an epidemic within the Bible prophecy community of trying to make every single event in the world align with some particular prophecy. And I think it discredits the study of biblical prophecy in a pretty profound way.
Mhm.
I will say, though, having been, teaching on YouTube for some years, the teacher that starts teaching on prophecy very quickly realizes that if they do that, they're going to get way more attention, way more clicks, and
Mhm.
this type of thing, and thus sort of grow their exposure. And so it's an addictive thing. It's a seductive, very, very dangerous thing. And unfortunately, it's what the people want. But I think it's something that you need to be incredibly careful with. Now, it's not to say that the Bible the language I use is this, is the prophets give us a pretty general description of the contours of the geopolitical landscape of the last days.
Mhm.
And again, it names nations, it describes alliances and sort of the arrangement of the Middle East in the last days. And so as we look out at the world, we go, yes, the geopolitical landscape today is aligning with some of these geopolitical alignments as the prophets thousands of years ago described. But when you start getting into real specifics, details, well, this nation is first going to invade this, and this is going to happen. They have all these really intricate, detailed, clear understanding of all the wars that are going to unfold and what nation's going to do this and what, that type of thing. That's where, in my opinion, it becomes really dangerous fast. And so I think it's fair to look at some broad, as I said, sort of the broad landscape of the Middle East, and to carefully, humbly peer into these things. But unfortunately, the way that it's often done is irresponsible, and as I said, it discredits the legitimate, study of these things. We're called to be watchmen, and Jesus said, for example, I grew up son of a fisherman. Up in Massachusetts, red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky at morning, sailor's warning. 5 years old, I knew how to look at the sky and to know whether or not I was going to go fishing with my dad the next day. Jesus essentially cites that very similar sort of little anecdote or quote, and he says, he rebukes his listeners. He says, you know how to interpret the signs in the weather, but you don't know how to interpret the signs of the times. So there are signs in the world that we're expected to recognize as having prophetic meaning. And Jesus actually rebuked his listeners for not knowing the season of his visitation. And likewise, in the last days, we should be aware of these things, but you can always take it too far. And I would say much of the prophecy community has done that. And there's probably even been times that I've been guilty of that myself over the years as I've, sort of stepped into this and learned how to do it right. But I think it's, as I said, something we need to be really, really careful of, because not only does it mislead and confuse unbelievers and believers, but it can actually destroy the teacher themselves as they start being looked to as some type of a guru who knows the future, every little intricate detail about nations and that sort of thing. And it's a very, as I said, it's a very dangerous approach to take.
Yeah, I actually quite agree with a lot of that. I would, with most of that, with probably all of it. Another question that I have, and I mean, with this is with the full acknowledgement that we can be completely wrong in how we believe things would come about. But do you believe that essentially there will be, in the last days leading up to this invasion of Israel, there will be like a revived Islamic caliphate ruled by a single imperial power that is Islamic?
Yes. Yeah, I do believe that. Now, to be clear, because of what I just sort of walked through, I think the scriptures are pretty clear about that. That said, one thing I am confident of is that I will get things wrong. Everybody has their own sort of like little pet views. And, I'll put my right arm on the chopping block, bet everything, but I'm going to get some of the things that I expect to happen will not come to pass exactly. And there are a lot of unknowns. But that said, the general picture, I think the Bible tells, we can trust that. And so, yeah, I do expect to see some type of a revived Middle Eastern empire, again, a 10-nation coalition led by just a dictator, an emerging strongman that the Bible refers to as the Antichrist.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? If you'd like to unmute, you're welcome to and ask. Joseph, go ahead.
Hi, Joel. Yeah, just a real quick question. I saw on Twitter you mentioned something recently about, about the Pope, and I've just had some questions about kind of how do you view Catholic brothers and sisters? How do you view the Catholic Church? Do you see them any differently in your reading of the end times? And how do you see things going forward? As Christ kind of builds, as Christ is coming back for a unified bride. Should we seek more unity with Catholic brothers and sisters, or just kind of what are your views of the Catholic Church? And we've had some Catholic people that we've talked to recently, and just kind of seeing how differently they view the end times. Just kind of understanding some of those differences. If you could shed any light on that, how you view kind of the Catholic Church, open Catholic brothers and sisters. Thanks.
Yeah. So being from Massachusetts, again, I was raised Catholic until I was about 11 or 12. We were very nominal, but technically I am Catholic because I made my first confession. I was confirmed or something like that. But then, I completely left after my parents got divorced. In fact, my CCD class, Catholic Catechism class, they voted me most likely to end up in jail. So it was actually a very prophetic little catechism class. But it was at 19 that I got saved. And so let me just say I am a son of the Reformation. I do think the Reformation was a divinely orchestrated thing to help restore the church back to a more biblical model. I haven't really told people, I don't really talk about this much, but I did go through a brief phase. It's pushing 15, 20 years ago now, during all of the emergent church hubbub, which was just this incredible movement that swept through Protestantism toward what I saw as a very subjective, more liberal decay. I was so frustrated by it that I was really tempted to actually convert to Eastern Orthodoxy. But that was much more of just my reaction against what I saw within Protestantism. This old joke, anecdote, I don't even know if it's true, but where this one Catholic guy says to Martin Luther, he says, "Luther, don't do this. If you do this, eventually there'll be one denomination for every Protestant." And there's kind of almost some truth to that. There's quite a degree of subjectivism within Protestantism, where it's all just up to our own individual opinions and this sort of thing. That said, during that season, as I was doing a lot of reading, I really did kind of fall in love with a lot of the history, the rich history of the Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodoxy when it comes to prayer. And I actually have a real affinity and love for some of the arts and the iconography in Eastern Orthodoxy, this type of thing. But there's also huge problems, with the incredible emphasis on Mary, a lot of these extra biblical doctrines that were added later in history. My perception, and this is how I would say it, is that, Jesus said there's wheat and there's tares everywhere. So there are true brothers and sisters growing up side by side next to each other. Protestantism has its own wheat and tares. Every church that you go to has genuine believers who attend Sunday service with tares who are not legitimate believers. And of course, we all try to go to a church where we perceive that has a much higher wheat ratio to tares. And I think the Catholic Church tends to have a much higher tare ratio. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is because I don't think they preach the gospel clearly. I think, they preach sacraments, and it becomes this very ritualistic, cultural religion, particularly in different parts of the world, where it's just, you're Catholic. I don't know how many times I've heard people when I first got saved, I try to share the gospel, and they say, "Don't talk to me about Jesus, I'm Catholic." And I go, well, it seems to me that if you're Catholic, you would love to talk about Jesus. but it's kind of like, I'm Catholic, I'm fine, leave me alone. And, you kind of, especially in the Northeast, you get a lot of that. So, there's things about it, quite frankly, now let me say this, what the funny thing is, oftentimes some of the best Catholics are Protestants who convert to Catholicism because they had this rich relationship with Jesus, and then they fall in love with some element of Catholicism, as I said, whether it be the liturgy or, the rich prayer life or this type of thing. And they tend to bring life to a lot of the ritual and the sacraments and this type of thing. But I see it as a negative. Like when I see a Protestant convert to Catholicism, I see it as a negative thing. But yeah, I do think there are plenty that know the Lord. The old question, can a Mormon really know the Lord? Can a Mormon be saved? And, in similar fashion, I would say, can a Catholic be saved? Well, yeah, I think any of them can be, but they have a lot of baggage. They have a lot of excess baggage, some of which is a distraction at best, or even destructive at worst. So, I'd say for a Protestant, most end time teachers, Catholics, that's the whore of Babylon, this type of thing. Well, it's kind of difficult to have dialogue with someone once you call them the whore of Babylon. And, so there tends to be this like incredibly negative, overly negative view of the Catholic Church. Again, because of Protestant eschatology that many of us have picked up to a degree by osmosis, and I would not agree with that at all. But I would continue with some of the legitimate criticisms of the Catholic Church, again, that came out of the Reformation. So I would leave it at that.
Thanks, Joel. That was a great response. Glenn and Sam from Zanesville House of Prayer. If you'd like to go ahead, Glenn.
Hi, Joel. I read your book, I think maybe around, it's been a while, it's like maybe 10 years ago. The one about Islam, it's Antichrist, Islam's awaited Messiah. Really good,
First
changed
book.
on a lot of my eschatology. So my question is, with the Antichrist is going to come and he's going to carry, it says, a religion that his fathers didn't carry. And that he's going to, I don't know what the word it used, but he's going to push forward a God that his fathers didn't know, and that it's going to be the God of strongholds. So it's kind of a two-part question, but the first part is, how do you see Islam in that? How do you see Islam as some kind of launching board for this new beast religion, and what does that look like?
Sure. So Daniel 11, it really makes a fourfold statement of faith, and it's often misunderstood because of English translations. But really, it makes four statements, and all of them need to be considered together. So it says he'll show no regard for the Elohim Ab, which is often translated as the God of his fathers. But this is a real common biblical phrase, and it almost every single time, it's used like 25 times throughout the Bible. Every single time it's Elohim Ab, comma, Elohim, Avraham, Yitzhak, and Jacob, right? Like it's the God of the fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's basically saying he'll show no regard for the God of the Bible. It's not saying he's going to reject his father's God. Now, he may do that as well, but it's a common biblical term, which means the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers. So he'll show no regard for God the Father. And then it says he'll show no regard for the desire of women. This is a Hebrew idiom referring to the Messiah. Ever since the Lord made the declaration to the serpent that I'm going to put conflict, enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. Every Hebrew woman was yearning to be the mother of the blessed one, to our brothers and sisters, fulfilled in Mary, so he'll deny the God the Father, he'll deny God the Son, and it says he'll show no regard for any other gods. So all the gods of the earth he rejects, but there is a God that he does honor, a God of forces, a God of war, a God of jihad. And so in so many ways, Islam really is just the continuation of any number of these ancient Near Eastern astral and war deities. And so to me, that matches Islam perfectly. Now, will he be, you can get into, will he be a convert to Islam, this type of thing? And then people go, well, if it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he must be Jewish. And then I go, no, actually, because do you guys remember the Sunday school song, Father Abraham had many sons, many, so he could be an Ishmaelite, he could be any number of things. It doesn't mean that he has to be Jewish. But the point is, he'll reject God the Father, he'll reject God the Son, he'll reject every other God, but he does have a God that he worships. And this is so important. When people say he's going to declare himself to be God, 2 Thessalonians 2, I go, actually, he declares himself to be superior to God. He sits in God's seat, but he also has a God. And the Bible, Daniel tells us it's a God of war. And I would actually, I would suggest that in 1 John, in the pastoral epistle, 1 John 2:22, where John the Apostle is describing the spirit of the theology of the Antichrist, he says he denies the Father. He says this is the spirit of Antichrist. He denies the Father, he denies the Son. That he's actually expounding upon and pointing back to Daniel 11, where it says he'll show no regard for the God of the fathers or the desire of women. And he says no one who denies the Son has the Father. And so John understood that the main place in the scriptures that described the theology of the lawless one, it was that very portion of Daniel 11. And this is the perfect Islam, its very creed is there's no God other than Allah, and Muhammad is the final messenger. It's a denial of the Father, denial of the Son. That's the very creed of Islam. It matches the biblical description of the theology of the Antichrist. So Angie Bear has a question in the chat. Do you want me to take that, Priscilla, first?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. In light of the Israel-centric perspective, how should we as Westerners respond and be aware of the signs Jesus gave in Matthew 24? So obviously in Matthew 24, he lays out a lot of what I'll say initially, the beginning of birth pains. And these are general things, wars, all the classic apocalyptic signs, wars, rumors of wars, et cetera, but he says, but when you see all of these things together, because you can point to any one of those things, wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines, you can point to those things as having taken place at various times throughout history. But Jesus says, when you see all of these things together, lift up your heads because your redemption draws nigh. Likewise, we can be paying attention to Israel and the rise of global hatred, again, the controversy of Zion that he returns to deal with. And we can pay attention to the news and recognize these things. And even, right now, what's just unfolded, if we see a lot of the violence and division that we expect to see as a result of Roe v. Wade being overturned, Jesus said right there in Matthew 24, nation will rise up against nation. So we think, well, that must mean, Canada and the United States, or not that we're going to go to war, but it's actually the word there in the Greek is ethnos will rise up against ethnos. So it's actually talking about racial divisions that can take, that's been unfolding in the United States in recent years. There'll be socioeconomic division, every division that one can think of that history has been repeatedly defined by, all the revolutions, the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, the slaughter in Rwanda, it's often a lower class rising up to kill an upper class, and then racial divisions and all. So you can see these things again in a broad sense. You can see them unfolding here in the West, but it's when he says when you see all of these things, and then specifically the ultimate, again, defining timing marker is when the Antichrist sets himself up in the temple, the abomination that causes desolation. Then that's when you transition from the beginning of birth pains to the actual birth pains. And then you're in that final 3.5 year tribulation, time of Jacob's trouble.
Thank you. That's great. Maybe one more question, and then if anyone has one, if not, that's it. We'll dismiss, but take a moment. I have one last thought, and maybe this could be your last thought, and then we'll have you.
Lisa was raising her hand, but it doesn't count because she didn't use the yellow emoji. She's just actually doing it.
I don't know how to do it.
Oh, okay. Okay, go ahead, Lisa.
I'm old school. I don't know how to do that. Hey, Joel. just first of all, just want to say thank you. I've learned so much from you. I first came across your writings right after 9/11, and I Googled Islam is the beast, and your stuff came up, and the light bulb went on. So just it's a rare opportunity to just say thank you for how much I've learned from you. I teach a little Bible study myself, and one of the things that we were contemplating a while back from Revelation 13 is the fact that the false prophet has the two horns of the Lamb. And is it possible that this could be like a false Messiah figure with a Jewish background, especially considering the Shiite teachings about the Mahdi and how Jesus is going to accompany him? Although I know that Islamic prophecy isn't, contemplated that?
I didn't. I heard about 80% of what you're saying, and I missed the final question.
Oh, sorry. Have you ever contemplated the thought that the false prophet, because he has the horns like a lamb, may be a false Jewish Messiah? Also considering the teaching of the Shiites regarding the Mahdi and that Jesus is going to accompany him and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the false prophet is a difficult issue because, interestingly, it doesn't talk, like almost everything throughout Revelation, it's been discussed in some detail earlier in the Bible. The false prophet is something that almost just sort of pops up, and you go, well, where did this come from? And there is some references in intertestamental literature to it. There was this Jewish view that in the last days, the Lord was going to slay Leviathan, the sea monster, and Behemoth, this land monster that would come up out of the earth, and he would kill them both and lay their bodies in the desert, and then the righteous would actually eat their flesh. So it's a very strange picture, and that sort of correlates to some of what you see in Revelation, but obviously those are just sort of weird intertestamental sort of legends. But so in Revelation, you've got this monster, that's Antichrist, the beast, but then you also have this second beast, as you said, that comes up out of the earth. And so oftentimes what people say in that case is that it comes up out of the land. In other words, the Eretz of Israel, the land of Israel. And so it's possible. It's possible that, he could be a Jewish false prophet. Others have suggested maybe the false prophet would, they'll say a Catholic or this type of thing. But the reality is we just don't know. Like, it could see within Islam, what they're expecting is their primary Messiah figure, the Mahdi, to come. They also believe that a Muslim Jesus will return, and that he'll tell everyone, hey, all you Christians, here I am. I'm Jesus. I've come back. Your Bible was corrupted. You've been following, sort of a false storyline. Islam is the true religion. I was a Muslim, and you all need to follow the Mahdi. Islam is the true religion. So, again, it doesn't say that in the book of Revelation that the false prophet will claim to be Jesus, but that is actually what Muslims are expecting. So could he be a false Muslim Jesus? Could he be a false Catholic false prophet? Could he be a Jewish? Any number of things could, it could be the case, but that's, I think, safely in the category of time will tell, and we need to be careful until then.
Awesome. Thank you, Joel. I feel like if we kept going, everyone would have more and more questions. So we're just going to have to invite you back sometime to share more, especially as these things unfold more and more. Thank you for taking the time. And thank you, everyone, for coming online. I know we're all going to celebrate tonight, and in our various ways with our families or with our communities. It's a great day to celebrate. Joel, I'll actually see you in Sinai. I'll be there in October.
All right.
Yeah, me and another person here as well. So I'll see you over then. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, Joel.
Thank you so much. And again, I am so sorry for falling asleep, literally, but but at least I woke up. At least it was only.
I thought you were just celebrating running through the streets for the overturn. No, you were taking a nap. That's very biblical as well.
I have a I have a red, white, and blue AR-15. I'm just running around,
Yeah.
popping it off in the neighborhood.
Awesome. Well, God bless you guys and have fun in your celebrations. It's a wonderful day. And thank you, Joel, for coming on.
Thank you all. Blessings.
You.
God bless you.